wind 050 at 8, runway 33, clear to land.
For land 33. We're good, weather update.
Affirmative, new information that I had just put out about 9 minutes ago. Visibility is 3/4, light snow, indefinite ceiling 1,200.
On January 25th, 2026, two flight crews faced identical weather at Bangor International Airport in Maine. One crew, Allegiant Airlines, went to the runway, performed a final wing check, saw their dicing had failed, and turned back. Minutes later, Bombardier Challenger 650N10KJ took the same runway and crashed, killing all 6 aboard. The Allegiant pilot radioed a warning about severe contamination to another aircraft on a separate frequency. The Challenger crew never heard it. They never knew what was waiting at the end of that runway. Understanding why critical safety information never reached the crew that needed it most might prevent the next tragedy. Bangor International Airport sits 240 miles north of Boston, a critical refueling hub for transatlantic operations. On the evening of January 25, 2026, a punishing winter storm gripped New England. Temperatures at Bangor plunged to 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Visibility dropped to 3/4 of a mile. Light snow fell steadily, or so the tower reported. Multiple aircraft were on the ground that evening, all making the same calculation. Can we safely depart in these conditions? The answer would depend on information each crew possessed. For some, that information would be complete. For others, it would be fatally incomplete. At 6:09 p.m., Challenger 650N10KJ touched down on runway 33, arriving from Houston Hobby Airport. Federal records linked the aircraft to a Houston-based company. According to the flight manifest, 6 people were aboard. The plan was straightforward: refuel in Bangor, de-icing the aircraft, and continue to an airport near Paris, France. This was a routine winter positioning flight, the kind business aviation handles thousands of times each season. The Challenger taxied to the de-icing pad. The crew requested standard treatment, everything proceeded normally, but on the same frequency, another drama was unfolding, and the Challenger crew had no idea. Approximately 30 minutes before N10KJ would attempt its takeoff, an Allegiant Airlines flight prepared to depart Bangor for Florida. The Allegiant crew had been de-iced. They received their takeoff clearance. They taxied toward runway 33. Standard procedure for winter operations requires one final check before taking the active runway, the pre-contamination check. One pilot visually inspects the wings to confirm de-icing protection remains effective and no new contamination has accumulated during taxi. The Allegiant crew performed this check. What they saw alarmed them. Despite de-icing treatment minutes earlier, contamination was visible on the wings. The de-icing fluid had failed. The Allegiant crew made an immediate decision: reject the departure and return to the gate. They notified Tower and began the taxi back. On the ramp, another crew heard this exchange. A Breeze Airways pilot using the call sign Moxie switched to a private frequency and contacted the Allegiant aircraft directly. "Did you guys fail the pre-contamination check?" he asked. The Allegiant pilot's response would prove chillingly accurate. According to reports, he described something unusual happening at the end of the runway. Precipitation that adhered to the wings as if no de-icing protection existed. "It clung to us like nothing was there," he reportedly said. This was not ordinary snow. This conversation occurred on a frequency the tower did not monitor. The Challenger crew did not monitor it either. They were on ground control frequency, coordinating their own de-icing and fuel load. The critical information, that de-icing was failing, that contamination was severe, that something dangerous was falling at the runway threshold, never reached them. This is not a failure of any individual. It's a structural limitation of aviation communication. Aircraft monitor assigned frequencies. Towers coordinate traffic. But informal crew-to-crew warnings on alternate frequencies exist outside this system. The Allegiant crew's experience became tribal knowledge for those who heard it. For those who didn't, the weather remained what Tower reported: light snow, 3/4 mile visibility, or acceptable for departure. At the de-icing pad, N10KJ received treatment for approximately 20 minutes according to ATC recordings. Type 1 fluid removes existing contamination. Type 4 fluid, thicker and gel-like, provides holdover time protection during taxi and takeoff. The crew completed their checks. They received taxi clearance. They proceeded toward runway 33. There is no evidence they knew about the Allegiant crew's experience. There is no evidence they knew de-icing was failing that evening. There is no evidence they understood what kind of precipitation was actually falling. They had the information tower provided. It wasn't enough. At 7:45 p.m., tower cleared N10KJ for takeoff on runway 33. According to ATC Communications, the controller provided current conditions. Good visibility on the runway visual range, light crosswinds. The controller reported light snow, the pilot acknowledged. The Challenger began accelerating down the runway. In the cockpit, the crew was executing a familiar procedure. Throttles advanced, engine parameters checked, airspeed increasing. The aircraft accelerated through 80 knots, then 100, then 120. At some point, we don't know exactly when, something went wrong. Approximately 2.5 minutes after takeoff clearance, a controller's voice erupted over the frequency. All traffic is stopped on the field. All traffic is stopped on the field. The urgency in that transmission is unmistakable to anyone who has flown. It means an emergency is unfolding right now. Moments later, another controller transmitted, "Aircraft upside down. We have a passenger aircraft upside down." Emergency vehicles raced toward runway 33. First responders arrived within a minute, according to airport officials. The aircraft lay inverted, engulfed in flames. All 6 people aboard were presumed dead. The crash occurred less than 3 minutes after the crew received takeoff clearance. The Allegiant crew's warning, delivered on a frequency they never heard, had come true. The question that haunts this accident is simple. What if the Challenger crew had heard the Allegiant pilot's warning? What if they had known that desing was failing at the runway threshold, that contamination was clinging despite treatment, that something more dangerous than ordinary snow was falling? Would they have performed their own pre-contamination check? Would they have delayed? Would they have canceled? We can't know, but we can analyze what they faced without that information, and what the Allegiant crew saw that made them turn back. The data tells us what happened. The question is why 2 professional crews facing identical conditions made opposite decisions. The NTSB is investigating this accident under case number CEN26FA098. Investigators have secured the wreckage, cockpit voice recorder, and flight data recorder. The FDR will show exact thrust settings, control inputs, airspeed, and configuration throughout the takeoff sequence. The CVR will reveal the crew's awareness in those final moments, whether they recognized contamination, whether they attempted to reject the takeoff, whether they had any warning before losing control. The preliminary report is expected within 30 days. But even now, certain evidence points toward a probable sequence of events. 3 theories have emerged among aviation analysts examining this crash. Theory 1 focuses on wing contamination and asymmetric stall during rotation. In this scenario, ice pellets or frozen precipitation accumulated on the wings during taxi from the desing pad to the runway. The desing fluid, designed primarily for snow protection, was overwhelmed. Ice pellets are fundamentally different from snow. They're dense, frozen, and adhesive. When they strike a cold metal wing at 2 degrees Fahrenheit, they can adhere almost instantly. As the Challenger accelerated and reached rotation speed, the pilot pulled back on the controls. The aircraft lifted off, but contamination on the wing disrupted airflow over the upper surface. The Bombardier Challenger 600 series uses a swept wing design optimized for high-speed cruise. Whilst this design is efficient but sensitive to leading-edge contamination. If ice accumulated asymmetrically, more on one wing than the other, one wing could stall while the other continued flying. The result would be an immediate violent roll. At low altitude with insufficient airspeed, recovery would be impossible. The aircraft would invert and impact the ground. This theory is consistent with preliminary accounts describing the aircraft appearing unstable shortly after liftoff. It's consistent with the rapid roll, and it's consistent with the Allegiant crew's experience, dicing failing in the face of severe contamination. Theory 2 considers a rejected takeoff on contaminated runway. Perhaps the crew recognized a problem during the takeoff roll, visible contamination through cockpit windows, an engine parameter anomaly, or abnormal handling characteristics. They attempted to reject the takeoff, applying maximum braking and possibly reverse thrust. But runway 33 was contaminated with snow and ice. Braking action would have been significantly degraded. At high speed, if the aircraft departed the prepared surface, the landing gear could have dug into snow or soft ground. The aircraft could have cartwheeled or rolled inverted. Fire would have erupted immediately when fuel tanks ruptured. This theory is less consistent with reports suggesting the aircraft became airborne before inverting, but it cannot be eliminated without examining the evidence. The FDR will show whether brakes were applied, whether reverse thrust was selected, and whether the aircraft remained on the runway surface or departed it. Rejected takeoffs at high speed on contaminated runways are inherently dangerous. The Challenger's stopping distance increases dramatically when braking action is poor. If the crew recognized the threat too late, past the critical decision speed, they would have faced an impossible choice: attempt to fly a contaminated aircraft or reject at a speed that might make stopping impossible. Either choice could be fatal. Theory 3 examines mechanical failure coinciding with environmental stress. Extreme cold creates multiple challenges for aircraft systems. Engines can experience starter issues, fuel flow problems, or reduced thrust output. Control surfaces can become sluggish if moisture infiltrates actuators and freezes. Hydraulic fluid viscosity increases in cold temperatures. However, this aircraft had just completed a successful flight from Houston. The engines had operated normally during landing and taxi. There were no reported mechanical issues during that portion of the flight. A catastrophic dual-engine failure at the worst possible moment during takeoff is exceedingly rare, and it would produce different witness observations: less rolling, more of a settling or inability to climb. An isolated flight control problem is also rare. Modern business jets have redundant control systems. A single hydraulic failure shouldn't render the aircraft uncontrollable, especially at low speeds during takeoff. If a control surface jammed or separated, the crew would likely have some warning: unusual forces on the controls, warning lights, or asymmetric handling during taxi. The NTSB will examine every system, every component, every maintenance record, but absent evidence of a pre-existing mechanical deficiency, environmental contamination remains the leading theory. The question is whether the crew knew what they were facing. Weighing all available preliminary evidence, the contamination theory appears most consistent with known facts. The Allegiant crew experienced desync failure minutes before N10KJ's departure. They described severe contamination adhering despite treatment. Audio evidence from local residences has been interpreted by some analysts as consistent with ice pellets, not snow. The tower reported light snow, which may have led the Challenger crew to believe conditions were manageable. Preliminary witness accounts suggest the aircraft lifted off before inverting, consistent with a wing stall. The Challenger 600 series has a documented history with cold weather contamination, serious enough that the FAA issued an airworthiness directive in 2008 following 3 incidents in Canada. What the NTSB will likely focus on: holdover time calculations, whether the crew performed a pre-contamination check, the crew's cold weather experience and training, communication between tower and departing aircraft about actual conditions, and whether other aircraft on the ground possessed information that never reached the Challenger crew. The cockpit voice recorder will be critical. It will reveal the crew's situational awareness, their understanding of the weather, their decision-making process, and whether they had any indication of contamination before it was too late. But there's something else that's been bothering me about this accident. Something systemic. The cockpit of a business jet during winter departure operations is a busy environment. Both pilots are engaged in multiple simultaneous tasks. The pilot flying manages controls, monitors instruments, and maintains aircraft control. The pilot monitoring handles radio communications, manages checklists, monitors systems, and cross-checks the flying pilot's actions. They're coordinating with ground control, tower, company operations, and possibly international clearance delivery for their oceanic crossing. They're computing fuel burns, checking NOTAMs, reviewing approach charts for their destination. They're setting up the flight management system, verifying route waypoints, confirming navigation database currency. This is standard workload for professional crews. They train for it, they manage it routinely, but this workload assumes the information they possess is complete and accurate. It assumes the weather observation from tower represents actual conditions throughout the airport. It assumes if another crew experienced a critical safety issue minutes earlier, that information would reach them. The Challenger crew operated with the data available. Tower said light snow visibility was acceptable, the airport was open, desync had been completed, other aircraft were operating. Each data point suggested normalcy. They didn't know what they didn't know. The Allegiant crew's experience never entered their decision-making process because they never heard it. This is a gap in our safety system. The Bombardier Challenger 600 series has been in production since the 1980s, with thousands of examples operating worldwide. The Challenger 650, the variant involved in this accident, is among the later and more advanced models. Federal records link N10KJ to a Houston-based company, suggesting corporate transportation use. The specific maintenance history of this aircraft has not been publicly released, but there's no indication of chronic mechanical issues or overdue inspections. The aircraft had successfully completed the flight from Houston earlier that evening. However, the Challenger 600 family has a documented vulnerability to cold weather contamination. In 2008, following 3 incidents in Canada where Challenger 600 series aircraft experienced control difficulties or accidents related to winter operations, the FAA issued an airworthiness directive. That directive required operators to add enhanced warnings to flight manuals about takeoff with contaminated wings. The swept wing design, while efficient for speed and range, is less forgiving of leading-edge ice or frost than straight wing designs. Even thin contamination can disrupt laminar airflow and precipitate a stall at speeds well above the wing's clean configuration stall speed. This isn't a design flaw. It's a design characteristic that demands rigorous contamination management. The question is whether the crew understood the threat they faced. Systemic factors extend beyond the cockpit. Aviation weather reporting relies on automated sensors and human observation, typically from the tower or terminal area, but weather at an airport isn't uniform. Localized phenomena can create vastly different conditions at different locations, particularly in winter storms. If tower reported light snow based on what was falling at the terminal, that may not have represented conditions at the runway threshold 3 miles away. Ice pellets can be difficult to distinguish from snow, especially at night. The acoustic signature is different. Ice pellets create a harder, crackling sound versus snow's soft patter, but this requires experience to recognize. Communication structure is another factor. When the Allegiant crew communicated their experience to the Breeze pilot, they did so on a frequency separate from tower operations. This is common. Crews often coordinate on company frequencies or air-to-air frequencies for informal communication. But critical safety information shared on these channels doesn't reach other aircraft unless they happen to be monitoring. There's no mechanism to ensure a warning like desing is failing at the runway threshold reaches every subsequent departure. The Challenger crew may have been monitoring only their assigned frequencies. The information they needed existed. It just never reached them. Every accident is a chain of events. Break one link, and 6 people go home that night. What should pilots learn from this tragedy? First, understand that weather reports represent observations from specific locations at specific times. Tower may report light snow while ice pellets fall at the runway threshold. Trust your senses. If you hear hard crackling sounds on your windscreen instead of soft patter, consider the possibility of ice pellets and treat them as a severe contamination threat. Second, perform a rigorous pre-contamination check before taking any runway in winter conditions. This isn't optional. Walk to the back of the cabin and visually inspect the wings. If you see any roughness, any discoloration, any contamination whatsoever, do not take off. Return for retreatment. Third, communicate. If you experience contamination issues, consider broadcasting a warning on tower frequencies so other departing aircraft hear it. If you hear another crew report contamination or return to the gate due to desing failure, treat that as intelligence. Their experience is your warning. Fourth, understand holdover times and respect them. Dicing fluid protects for a limited period depending on temperature and precipitation intensity. If you've been delayed, your protection may have expired. Fifth, when in doubt, don't go. The airport being open doesn't mean your specific departure is safe. The pressure to continue is real. The cost of being wrong is measured in lives. 6 people boarded Challenger N10KJ expecting a routine transatlantic positioning flight. As of this writing, their identities have not been fully released pending family notification. They were someone's parents, children, spouses, friends. They had plans in Paris, lives to return to, futures ahead of them. All of that ended on a frozen runway in Maine because critical information never reached the crew responsible for their safety. We owe these 6 people more than grief. We owe them a thorough investigation that examines not just what happened in the cockpit, but why safety information didn't flow between crews facing identical threats. The NTSB's preliminary report will be available within 30 days under case number CEN26FA098. The final report will take 12 to 24 months. As those reports emerge, we'll return to this accident with updated analysis. If you're a pilot, follow this investigation closely. The lessons here touch every aspect of winter operations: contamination recognition, communication protocols, decision-making under uncertainty. Aviation safety advances one accident at a time, written in tragedy, but built on the promise that we'll learn, we'll change, and we'll prevent the next one. That's what we owe them.